President Biden recently announced a COVID-19 vaccination policy, which would require certain businesses to either require their employees to get vaccinated or show proof of a negative COVID test each week. And while more than half of Americans polled do actually agree with some form of vaccination policy, it does pose legal challenges for those businesses that are affected. I'm Skye Schooley, a staff writer with business.com, and today I'm joined by Bryn Goodman. She's an attorney with Fox Rothschild to get some expert insight on this topic and how it affects those businesses. Hey, Bryn, thank you so much for joining us today. As you're aware, today we're talking about the recent vaccination mandate that President Biden has announced. And to get us started, what type of businesses or industries are primarily impacted by this policy?
So this policy is going to impact all large employers. Any employer with 100 or more employees is going to have to consider whether to mandate vaccinations or to test weekly or some hybrid of that. The mandate also applies to, and actually a stricter mandate applies to federal contractors and all federal employees and anyone who's on site at a healthcare facility, which initially only included long-term care facilities, but now it's been expanded to any facility, any hospital, any healthcare setting that receives Medicare or Medicaid funding. So, that's the other part of the mandate. That's for federal employees, but it really impacts the private sector in some regard too.
Okay, and so for those employers who are affected, could they essentially terminate an employee for refusing to get the vaccine, or how does that shake out?
So you want to talk to an attorney before terminating any employee who refuses to get the vaccine. But as a general proposition, you're going to see sort of, two camps of employees who are refusing vaccination. Those who are refusing based on a health concern, a disability of some kind that prevents them from getting the vaccination. They've received, medical advice that says they should not be receiving the vaccination. And those who have a religious concern or a sincerely held religious belief where they are refusing to be vaccinated. Both of those types of employees, those are in one camp. Those are people who likely would be exempted or should be considered to be exempted. And then you have employees who just don't want to get the vaccine because they don't want to get the vaccine with no actual religious or health concern related to it. Now, if you're an employer and you implement a written policy that's in line with what the president's mandate states, and it's either, you're requiring vaccinations or you're requiring testing weekly, and you provide in that policy, obviously contact us if you need an accommodation, and someone just refuses or they quit, et cetera, or they tell you, I don't have a health reason, I don't have a religious objection, but I don't want to get it. Those people are now, violating a written company policy, and you'd have pretty strong grounds to terminate them. Again, speaking to a lawyer, because you want to be careful how you deliver that message. You want to be careful what you put in writing or what you say to that person. But frankly, they probably don't have a leg to stand on, because you can make, any company policy pretty much you want to, as long as it doesn't violate the law. And that's why those other camp of people who are objecting on a disability or religious basis should be considered on an individualized case-by-case analysis, and sort of whether or not their position, you can create, different roles or accommodations for them to enable them to continue working because they are protected by the law.
And in addition to terminating employees, what other potential legal challenges might businesses face that are impacted by this policy?
Yeah, I think we're going to see legal challenges. There's already been talk of challenging the OSHA regulation it's called an emergency temporary standard that OSHA would be issuing. And, there's chatter about challenging that emergency temporary standard for a variety of reasons. Already in New York, we've seen a temporary restraining order issued by a judge in the Northern District of New York, where the judge granted a restraining order against it was the New York State Department of Health that was issuing a regulation mandating vaccinations. And the regulation said that religious exemptions would not be considered at all. So a variety of doctors got together and sued, and their basis was their First Amendment rights as applies to the states by the 14th Amendment, and basically saying, you can't just exclude any religious exemption, especially if you're allowing people to raise disability exemptions. What's the difference between someone who's being permitted to have an accommodation or being permitted to continue working without being vaccinated because they have a disability, but I have a religious objection, which is also protected under the law, and I'm not being exempted? The judge thought there might be merit to that and issued a temporary restraining order. There are going to be papers, and we'll see what happens if a preliminary injunction, a permanent injunction is actually granted. But that's long-winded to say that employers should consider that when they do this, when they implement this kind of a policy, they need to make sure that they have the right, opportunity, avenue, process, and procedure in place for people to raise their concerns and to have a dialogue. It's very important to have an interactive process or a dialogue to determine whether an accommodation can be made for the two issues I raised, disability or religious accommodation.
Great. And I think you had already kind of touched on this, on saying that they need to have the proper procedures and policies in place. Are there any other ways that businesses can overcome the challenges of implementing this mandate for their companies?
You're going to want to try and prepare your management, whoever's delivering the message, for some pushback, especially because people have wide-ranging views, and you want to really approach it from we're doing our best to comply with the law, to follow the public health guidance, to follow any mandate. We have to comply with OSHA. We have to have safety standards at work, and so we hear you. We're going to do our best to work with you, but we also are doing our best to run our business in such a way that complies with the law. So you want to be prepared for those conversations. You want to train your managers to have those conversations. Again, you want to review and distribute the appropriate forms so that people are aware, hey, this is the process, this is what we need to do, and everyone is well educated before you start the process. And you also, really important would be giving your employees lead time. Right now, the federal mandate requires that employees get their first dose of the vaccine in November, to be completed by November 22nd is the end date. November 8th is the first shot requirement. So, you have plenty of time right here where it's September 20th. You want to give people that lead time. So get your policies written now, even though the emergency temporary standard isn't in place. Start having that conversation early.
Before we wrap it up here, did you have any final thoughts on how serious businesses should take this? I mean, I couldn't imagine there's a vaccine police running around checking every single business, or maybe there will be. I really don't know. Kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, OSHA does do inspections. And so I think if they're getting complaints from employees, that's where you're going to get on their radar. And so, you want to take the temperature on your employees. And if you think they're going to be complaints, you don't really know. But, OSHA has in place people to investigate whether or not health standards are being met. And so they have in place, already they're checking manufacturing sites for other health and safety issues. And so I wouldn't be surprised that if they were doing a random check, that they would also ask, hey, do you have in place this policy? And, and that could get you into hot water. So you're going to look out for either the likelihood that an employee would complain, or the likelihood that you would be subject to some sort of investigation by OSHA. But I think there's a higher likelihood now than ever, because vaccines are top of mind and people have objections to them one way or another.
Great. Well, that was all that we had for today, Bryn. Thank you so much for joining me.